I had to hide an alien from the military, and what he was hiding changed my faith forever. It started the night the sky tore open over the mountains, when something not of this earth fell burning into the trees behind my house. I thought I was saving a wounded creature. I didn't know I was protecting a messenger, one carrying proof that death isn't the end, and that God hides in frequencies we've forgotten how to hear. Before we begin, like this video, share it with someone who still believes miracles only belong to the past, and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Tell me, where are you listening from tonight? Because as we return to that storm-drenched night, to the moment I opened my basement door and saw him bleeding light across the floor, remember this: some truths are never meant to be contained, and faith, once awakened, can never go back to sleep. The air in the basement trembled like it was alive. Every bulb flickered, every shadow twisted with its own pulse, and Charles could hear the hum of something beyond sound itself. It wasn't electricity. It wasn't fear. It was life, compressed into a single, impossible moment. The house above him shook as soldiers shouted his name, boots pounding against the floorboards, their voices echoing through the vents like thunder in a storm cellar. But Charles didn't move. He couldn't. He was kneeling before something that shouldn't exist, and yet there it was, bleeding light onto the cracked concrete floor. The being's name was Thalos, though even that word felt too small to contain what he was. His skin shimmered like the reflection of stars on deep water. His breath a whisper of vibration rather than air. Every exhale dimmed the room's light. Every inhale reignited it. Beside him, the crystalline sphere pulsed in Charles's trembling hands, its glow shifting through colors no human eye was ever meant to see. Inside it, voices whispered in unison, thousands, maybe millions, layered like a chorus of souls calling through time. Charles didn't understand what he was holding, only what it meant. He had been told that if the soldiers took this sphere, everything humanity believed about life and death would be erased, buried in steel vaults, labeled as classified truth. His faith had been broken for years, shattered by too many nights watching people die alone. Yet here, in the middle of chaos, kneeling beside something dying but eternal, he felt faith again, raw and trembling, like the first spark of creation. Thalos's voice came, not through the air, but through the marrow of his bones. If they take this, your species forgets its soul forever. The words sank, deeper than thought. Charles looked down at the sphere, watching the glow travel into his palms. He could hear heartbeats inside it, human ones, racing, slowing, stopping, continuing beyond the edge of death. The soldiers shouted again. Metal boots clanged on the basement door. It was seconds from breaking. He could turn it all over, surrender the being and the light, and maybe live. Or he could trust the voice of something not from this world, something that spoke like truth itself. The sphere pulsed faster now, light leaking between his fingers. Sirens screamed above the house. The air thickened. Time bent. And in that final moment before everything shattered, Charles pressed his hand against the glowing heart of the sphere. The voices stopped, the light rose, and the entire world seemed to inhale. Then, with a brilliance beyond comprehension, reality itself exploded into white. 3 hours earlier, the night was a curtain of rain so heavy it blurred the world into liquid shadow. Charles drove alone, windshield wipers fighting a losing battle against the storm, headlights carving short tunnels of visibility through the downpour. The hum of the engine was the only sound that kept him tethered to reality. But his mind wasn't on the road. It was still trapped in the hospice, in that dimly lit room where his last patient had whispered words that refused to fade. "He's coming for you next." The sentence replayed in his thoughts like a broken recording, one that grew stranger the more he remembered, the look in her eyes, wide, aware, certain. She had spoken it not in fear, but in warning. Charles had dismissed it as delirium then, a byproduct of morphine and the mind's last attempt to make sense of dying. But as the rain pounded harder, something inside him began to stir. A quiet unease that made his pulse sync with the rhythm of the storm. The clock on the dashboard glowed faintly 2:15 in the morning, the hour when the world seems to fold in on itself. The empty highway stretched endlessly, wet and reflective like a dark mirror. Trees leaned toward the road, skeletal branches trembling under the weight of water, their outlines warping in flashes of lightning. He told himself to stay focused, to get home, to sleep. But when the flash came, it was not lightning. It was something else, something that moved. A streak of light cut across the clouds and split open the sky. It wasn't a plane. It wasn't a meteor. It was slower, deliberate, like a thought descending from heaven. The light changed color as it fell from silver to blue to something no spectrum could define, and then the forest ahead erupted in a muffled roar. The ground shook. The light vanished. Silence returned, unnaturally sudden. Charles gripped the wheel, frozen, every rational part of him screaming to keep driving. Whatever that was, it wasn't his concern. It wasn't safe. Yet curiosity, that ancient defect of the human soul, overpowered fear. He slowed to a crawl, headlights sweeping the wet asphalt, the forest edge trembling in the wind. Steam rose from where the light had fallen, curling through the trees like breath from something alive. The smell of ozone filled the air, sharp, electric, unnatural. He knew he should go. He knew turning back was the only sane decision. But something unseen pulled at him, subtle and magnetic, whispering through the static of the rain. Against every instinct, Charles turned off the engine, opened the door, and stepped into the darkness. The forest was soaked in silence. Every drop of rain seemed to hang in the air before touching the ground, as if time itself was holding its breath. Charles pushed through the wet underbrush, his shoes sinking into mud that clung like tar. The smell was wrong, metallic and burning, like the air after lightning strikes, but deeper, heavier, almost alive. Ahead, through the tangle of trees, the ground glowed faintly blue. It wasn't a reflection or the trick of his headlights. It was a steady pulse of light radiating from the earth itself. He followed it until the trees gave way to a clearing, and that's when he saw it. The crater was vast, almost perfectly circular, edges still steaming, soil fused into glass where unimaginable heat had struck. In the center, blue mist coiled upward like smoke from a celestial fire. It moved unnaturally, forming patterns that dissolved as quickly as they appeared, as though the mist had memory. Charles's breath caught when he realized there was something inside the crater, a shape, a body. He slid down the slope, boots slipping in wet ash, his heart pounding in rhythm with the pulse of the light. As he got closer, he saw that the shape wasn't human, but it wasn't alien in the way he had imagined either. It lay sprawled on its back, chest rising faintly. The skin was translucent, faintly glowing beneath the rain. Not skin at all, but a membrane that shimmered like liquid glass, through which veins of light pulsed in slow, rhythmic waves. Where blood should have been, light flowed white at first, then blue, fading to violet as it seeped into the mud. Its body emitted a faint vibration, a low hum that Charles felt through his bones rather than heard with his ears. It was as though the being was alive in more frequencies than one, existing slightly beyond the visible world. For a moment, Charles thought it was already dead. But then its fingers twitched long, jointed differently, elegant like sculpted glass. The head turned slightly toward him, and where eyes should have been, there were two orbs of light that flickered like distant stars. The hum grew louder, syncing with Charles's heartbeat until the two rhythms became one. Then, without moving its lips, the air itself spoke inside his skull. Not sound, but meaning. A voice woven into thought. "Help me." The words didn't echo, they resonated. "They're coming." Charles froze. every muscle tightening. The forest around him felt suddenly aware, like it was listening. The mist thickened, rising higher, and through it he thought he saw faint beams of red slicing the distant sky. Helicopters? Drones? He didn't know. The being stirred weakly, the light from its body dimming with each passing second. Something primal shifted inside. Charles' fear, awe, and an inexplicable need to protect whatever this was. The rain fell harder, washing mud from the crater's rim, and for the first time in his life, he realized he was standing on the edge of two realities colliding. The human world and something far older, far greater. And whatever had fallen from the sky was still alive and being hunted. The storm followed him home like a living thing. The sound of thunder seemed to chase the car down every empty road, flashes of light reflecting in the rearview mirror as if the sky itself was watching. By the time Charles reached his house, his hands were shaking so badly he could barely fit the key into the lock. The basement door creaked open, the old wooden steps groaning beneath his weight. The smell of rain mixed with something new, metallic and sweet, like ozone wrapped in warmth. Behind him, wrapped in a soaked tarp from the car's trunk, the impossible being he had pulled from the crater lay motionless. He didn't know why he brought it here. He told himself it was because it needed help, but deep down, he knew curiosity had become possession. Whatever it was, it had chosen him when it spoke those words inside his mind. He laid it gently on the cold table, the flickering basement light reflecting across its translucent skin. Every few seconds the bulb dimmed, pulsing in rhythm with the faint luminescence inside the creature's body, as if the entire room had fallen into its heartbeat. The wound was severe, a deep rupture across the torso that glowed rather than bled. Instead of blood, threads of light spilled out, forming thin streams that floated briefly in the air before fading. Charles reached for a cloth and instinctively began to clean it. He didn't understand what he was touching, only that it responded. The closer his hand came, the brighter the being's light became, its internal rhythm syncing with his pulse. It was not dying in the way humans died, it was unraveling, slipping out of the frequency of existence it shared with the physical world. Beneath its translucent layer, he saw organs unlike anything he had ever studied. They weren't organs of flesh, but structures of vibration, spirals of energy moving in perfect geometric harmony. Some pulsed slowly, others shimmered at incredible speed, each emitting faint tones that formed a kind of music beyond hearing. It wasn't chaotic, it was orchestral. The creature's body was alive with order, with sacred geometry hidden within flesh that wasn't flesh at all. As Charles watched, something stirred in the being's chest, a rhythm that changed pitch like the tuning of a cosmic instrument. And then, without sound, a word formed directly inside his mind. Thalos. The name wasn't spoken but transmitted, vibrating in his bones like a memory he never knew he had. It wasn't a name in the human sense, it was a frequency, an identity woven in resonance. He understood then that what lay before him was not from another planet, but from somewhere deeper, a dimension interwoven with this one, yet invisible to human perception. Not space, not distance, vibration, a higher plane overlapping their reality like two songs played at once, one loud, one silent. And somehow, through accident or intention, Thalos had fallen out of harmony and into the density of the human world. The light within him dimmed again, flickering with each breath. Charles adjusted the towel, pressing gently against the wound, and for a brief second, the pulse beneath his hands aligned perfectly with his own heartbeat. The light brightened, the hum deepened, and something vast, unseen, and ancient seemed to awaken between them. Something that was watching, waiting, and aware. Outside, the night began to roar. Helicopters swept through the sky like predators, their searchlights tearing across the clouds and spilling through the thin curtains of Charles's home. The television upstairs played breaking news, a frantic voice calling it a meteor, an object that entered the atmosphere before vanishing somewhere near the outskirts of town. But Charles knew it hadn't vanished. It was beneath his house, breathing in the dark. Each thump of rotor blades vibrated through the walls, syncing with the pulse of the creature lying motionless in his basement. Thalos. The name still hummed in his mind, like an echo that couldn't fade. Charles moved quickly. Every instinct screamed at him to hide what he'd brought home, though he still didn't fully understand what it was. The creature's body emitted soft waves of light that shifted with every breath. And every time the light grew brighter, the bulbs in the basement flickered, like the world above was trying to match its rhythm. The air smelled faintly metallic, charged, and the house's temperature had dropped by several degrees. Charles wrapped the being in thick blankets and carried it to the far end of the basement, where an old freezer room stood unused for years. He opened the heavy metal door, and the cold air inside wrapped around him like breath from a tomb. Carefully, he placed Thalos inside, closing the latch halfway so air could still pass through. He turned off the basement light, leaving only the faint blue shimmer of Thalos's glow illuminating the walls like ghostly veins. Moments later, a sound shattered the silence, a convoy approaching, tires grinding over wet gravel, engines low and coordinated, the rhythmic beat of trained movement. Charles ran upstairs, his chest tightening. Through the rain-streaked window, he saw dark vehicles with no markings moving past his driveway, headlights off, stopping briefly at each house. Voices carried through the storm, clipped and commanding. A knock followed, heavy and sharp, echoing through his front door. He forced himself to breathe evenly before answering. The porch light caught the outline of two men in dark uniforms, helmets glistening with rain. Their questions were curt. Had he seen anything fall from the sky, any unusual noise or smoke in the woods? Charles shook his head, each word of denial tasting like static on his tongue. He could feel Thalos's presence beneath the floorboards, the faint vibration of something not quite human resonating through the soles of his feet. For a moment, he thought they could hear it too, that the hum might give him away. But the soldiers simply exchanged a look, thanked him, and moved on. As their footsteps faded, Charles shut the door, locked it, and leaned against the wall, every nerve on fire. The world outside was hunting something it couldn't possibly comprehend, and inside his basement, he was hiding the reason why. The helicopters circled again, light slashing across his ceiling, and he realized with dreadful certainty that the pursuit had already begun, not just for Thalos, but for the truth itself. The storm quieted near dawn, leaving the air thick with mist that pressed against the windows like breath. The helicopters had gone, but the hum of their presence lingered in Charles's nerves. He sat at the basement stairs, staring into the dark where Thalos rested behind the freezer door. The house was still, yet the silence carried weight, as if something vast and unseen filled the empty space between the walls. Every so often, a faint vibration rippled through the air, a pulse that wasn't sound but sensation, echoing faintly in his bones. He could feel it even when he tried not to. It was like the earth itself was whispering through him. When he finally opened the freezer door, the glow inside was weaker but steady. Thalos lay still, the translucent surface of his body shimmering faintly in soft waves like moonlight on deep water. The air smelled faintly of ozone again, sharper this time, charged as if holding electricity. Charles didn't speak, yet he felt the presence reach toward him through thought, the same way it had in the crater. But this time it wasn't pleading. It was deliberate. The thoughts that entered his mind came with a calm gravity that froze him in place. The being was awake. In the quiet of that hidden room, Thalos revealed something that made Charles's breath stop entirely. The being told him he was not the first of his kind that Charles had seen. The words didn't sound like revelation, they felt like remembrance, as if some long-buried memory was surfacing in him. Images drifted through his mind unbidden. The hospice bed, the dim light, Dorothy's last moments, and the name that had haunted him for months, Thalen. The alien presence that had appeared to him the night a patient crossed over, the same night Charles questioned everything he knew about death. Now that same energy vibrated here in the basement, but denser, stronger, more deliberate. Thalos was different, but connected. Through the telepathic current between them, Charles sensed no deceit. The being spoke of a continuum, an order of entities that existed between dimensions, guiding the migration of consciousness from one plane to the next. Thalen had been one of them, the guide of transition. Thalos, however, had come for something deeper. His message was not about the afterlife, but about the living, the boundary between the physical and the spiritual that humans no longer perceived. Thalos told him that he had been sent not because of chance, but because Charles had once witnessed truth and did not flee from it. He had seen beyond the veil and still chosen to stay human, to return to his duties, to walk back into the ordinary world as if nothing had happened. That decision had marked him. Few ever witnessed what he did and survived with their sanity intact. Thalos said that moment had altered his resonance, a subtle shift that could be sensed across realities. The Order noticed. The room's temperature seemed to drop further as Charles absorbed the revelation. The faint hum grew more complex, forming harmonics like the overtone of a forgotten song. He felt as though invisible layers of existence were brushing against one another right where he stood. Thalos radiated something ancient knowledge that stretched beyond time, yet focused entirely on him. The connection was undeniable. They were bound by an unseen purpose, two frequencies tuned to the same truth. The basement light flickered once, then steadied, and Charles understood with quiet awe that his life had just crossed a threshold again. Whatever he thought reality was, it had never been whole. Not until now. The morning light never reached the basement. It remained a chamber of twilight, where the ordinary laws of the world seemed reluctant to enter. The hum that surrounded Thalos had deepened into something melodic, like distant chords vibrating beneath the fabric of silence. Charles stood near the freezer door, watching as faint ripples of luminescence coursed along the alien's form, tracing veins of light that converged at the center of his chest. The air smelled faintly of static and iron, but there was another undertone beneath it, something sweet, almost floral, like the scent of ozone mixed with life. Without movement, without words, Thalos summoned an energy that made the entire room respond. The objects around them, the shelves, the metal table, even the bolts in the wall vibrated at a frequency Charles could feel in his teeth. And then he saw it. A subtle outline forming in the alien's chest, just below the sternum, glowing brighter with every heartbeat of light. The glow pulsed once, then twice, until it became a soft radiance, shaped like a sphere embedded within the being's body. It was small, no larger than a human heart, but the energy that emanated from it filled the entire space. Thalos raised a trembling hand, his translucent fingers parting at the center as if peeling back layers of light. The skin did not tear, it unfolded, revealing what looked like crystalline architecture beneath. From within emerged the sphere, suspended just above his chest, rotating slowly in the air, as if gravity had no authority over it. It wasn't made of any material Charles recognized. Its surface was both solid and fluid, reflecting light that didn't come from the room. Inside it moved shapes, flecks of gold, silver, and blue like galaxies seen through a tear in the sky. The sound that came from it wasn't noise but language. Whispering voices drifted into the air, faint and overlapping, countless murmurs blending into a single tone that resonated with emotion rather than words. Charles could feel them before he could understand them. Echoes of joy, sorrow, wonder, and fear. They weren't mechanical recordings. They were alive, He realized with dawning terror and reverence that what he was hearing were fragments of thought, final impressions from people in their last moments. The sphere pulsed again, and warmth spread through the basement like sunlight beneath water. It reached him, wrapping around his heart until he felt it beat in rhythm with the glow. It wasn't frightening. It was deeply human. Every flicker of light inside the sphere seemed to contain a life, a memory preserved not in image, but in feeling. The realization settled into him like gravity made of truth. This was not technology. It was a vessel, a living archive that gathered the final vibrations of human consciousness as they crossed the boundary of death. Each whisper was a continuation, not an ending, a translation from one state of being into another. In the silence that followed, Charles understood that the object before him was proof not just of existence after death, but of a bridge that connected both sides. He felt Thalos's awareness in his mind once again, clear and deliberate. The thought came like a resonance, more than a sentence, but the meaning was undeniable. This was proof of continuity, proof that death was not destruction, but transition. What humanity called an ending was merely the sound of one frequency changing into another. The sphere continued to turn slowly, glowing brighter with every breath Charles took. The light it emitted wasn't cold like machinery, it was alive, carrying within it the collective heartbeat of countless souls. He stood there trembling, realizing that everything he had believed about mortality, spirit, and faith was far too small for what now shimmered before him. And somewhere in that unearthly harmony of whispers, he thought he heard his own name spoken not by Thalos, but by the echo of someone he once lost, calling him from the other side. The sphere was heavier than it looked. When Charles reached out and let it rest in his palms, its weight didn't press against his skin, it pressed into him, as if gravity had been replaced by intention. The surface was smooth and warm, almost alive, and as his fingers closed around it, he felt it respond. The glow intensified, threads of light crawling up his wrists, like veins of fire made gentle. The hum in the air deepened until the entire room seemed to breathe with it. Every flicker of the bulb, every drop of rain outside, every beat of his own heart began to fall into the same rhythm. At first, it was only light, swirling colors that pulsed and folded within themselves, like living smoke. Then, images began to form, not like hallucinations, but like memories that did not belong to him. He saw faces he had never met, eyes closing in peace or terror, hands reaching for loved ones who weren't there. Each image lasted a heartbeat before dissolving into another, faster and faster, until he was no longer observing but experiencing. He was inside their final moments, feeling them as if they were his own. He felt the breath of an old man taking his last gasp beside a hospital bed, the gentle release of a mother whispering her child's name for the last time, the sharp, stunned silence of a soldier realizing he would never return home. But alongside these came other sensations: joy, serenity, revelation. A young woman smiling as she saw light filling her vision, a child laughing in the instant before everything faded, a whisper of forgiveness that vibrated through him like a prayer. Each fragment carried emotion so pure it bypassed thought and struck directly into the soul. Charles's body trembled, but not from fear. What filled him was something else, something vast and wordless. He felt his own consciousness expand, stretching across the invisible web that connected every life to every other. He could hear thoughts, dreams, prayers, the constant murmur of humanity woven into the pulse of existence. Every word ever spoken, every hope ever felt, still lingered somewhere, echoing endlessly in a dimension beyond time. Nothing was ever lost. Not truly. Tears ran down his face as the truth unfolded inside him. Consciousness did not vanish. It transformed. Death was not erasure, but translation. The boundaries between body and spirit were as thin as breath. And what crossed them was not a soul departing. It was the same energy returning to its origin. For years, faith had been a hollow word to him, something he left behind in the corridors of hospitals where suffering seemed endless and prayers unanswered. But in this moment, faith was no longer a belief. It was recognition, not of doctrine, but of design. The beauty of order that lived beneath chaos, the divine symmetry that turned pain into understanding, loss into connection. When the light finally dimmed, he found himself kneeling, the sphere still pulsing softly in his hands. Its warmth no longer burned, it comforted. Around him, the air shimmered faintly, as if reality itself were exhaling after holding its breath. His heart slowed, his mind quieted, and the silence that followed was not emptiness. It was awe, the kind that doesn't demand worship, only wonder. For the first time in years, Charles believed again. Not in heaven, not in salvation, but in the breathtaking truth that everything, even death, was still part of one endless, living light. By dawn, the forest was no longer a place of silence but a grid of surveillance. The air itself seemed to hum with tension as searchlights combed the wet landscape and mechanical drones drifted between the trees like predatory insects. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the military net had already closed, invisible and absolute. Radios whispered in coded bursts, and convoys of unmarked vehicles moved through the back roads of the small town that still slept unaware of the secret unfolding beneath its soil. The government had named it a meteor strike, but in the private corridors of a facility miles away, it was called something else, the incident. At the center of the operation stood Agent Hollis, a man forged in the machinery of classified truths. He was not the kind of man who believed easily. Yet belief had begun to stalk him in the shadows of his own skepticism. He had seen the surveillance footage, an object falling slower than any rock should, radiating not heat but structured energy, the kind that behaved like language written in light. Now that object was gone, vanished from radar minutes after impact. And Hollis, bound by duty and haunted by curiosity, had been tasked with finding it. To his team, he framed the mission in simple terms. The object was a foreign device, potentially hostile, its retrieval vital to national security. But privately, he had already read fragments of old reports declassified too late, buried too deep. Incidents where so-called meteor impacts produced anomalies, electromagnetic fluctuations, recorded voices in radio static, witnesses claiming to see human figures made of light. Every case had ended the same way: containment, silence, and the quiet rewriting of history. Hollis knew the pattern too well, and this time, something inside him refused to accept the cover story he was helping to build. By mid-morning, checkpoints surrounded the outer ring of the town. Satellites tracked every heat source larger than a raccoon. Helicopters scanned for irregular frequencies, and soldiers combed through the forest where the crater had burned through the earth only hours before. Yet what none of them knew was that the real anomaly wasn't there anymore. It was hiding beneath the home of a man who still thought he could keep secrets from the sky. As Hollis watched the live feed on his monitor, he saw something impossible. The instruments recorded faint pulses emanating from a single house, consistent, rhythmic, too deliberate to be random. Not heat, not sound, but vibration. Like a heartbeat made of light. He didn't tell his men what he suspected. Not yet. To them, it was a simple recovery operation. To him, it was something else entirely. The readings matched no known technology. They matched a frequency pattern he had once seen in a forgotten file labeled non-terrestrial theological correlations. It suggested that the object, whatever it was, carried an intelligence older than humanity's understanding of life and death. Agent Hollis felt the contradiction tearing quietly within him. His badge told him this was a threat. His instincts whispered it was revelation. Beneath his orders, beneath the layers of secrecy and fear, a single thought took root, a thought dangerous enough to destroy his career if spoken aloud. What if what had fallen from the sky wasn't meant to be captured? What if it was meant to be found? Morning came, but the light felt wrong, pale and artificial, like the world had forgotten how to rise. Charles hadn't slept. He sat at the edge of the basement stairs, the hum of the sphere still whispering through the floor like a pulse beneath the house. Every hour, he thought about the soldiers combing the woods, about the sound of boots in the rain and engines moving closer. He thought about calling for help, about doing the logical, lawful thing. He could end this. One phone call, and it would be out of his hands. The government would come, take the being, take the strange artifact, and maybe his life would return to something resembling normal. But even as the idea formed, it curdled inside him. Normal was a lie. After what he had seen, there was no going back to normal. He looked toward the freezer door. Beyond it, Thalos rested, the glow from his body faint but constant. The air around that room seemed to breathe with awareness. The sphere, now sealed inside a lead container he had found in the garage, still pulsed faintly through the metal. And every time he touched it, he could feel the echo of humanity inside the millions of voices that had brushed his mind. They were real, not hallucination or dream, and he knew that the world above would not understand. They would dissect, classify, and deny until the truth was buried so deep no one could feel it again. He imagined men in suits locking the sphere behind reinforced doors, labeling it unstable energy, its meaning reduced to data and risk assessment. That thought filled him with quiet dread. His mind turned over the same conflict again and again, a war between reason and revelation. He was a man of medicine, trained to act through logic and evidence, yet nothing about Thalos belonged to the physical rules of existence. What if keeping the being hidden was wrong? What if his secrecy endangered more lives? And yet, what if exposing it meant losing the very thing that proved the soul was more than chemical fire in the brain? The hum grew louder, not in sound but in presence. It felt like thought pressing against his own, guiding him inward rather than outward. A single awareness threaded through his consciousness, calm and heavy with truth. It told him that fear was the weapon of those who sought to control light. If the sphere was taken, it would vanish beneath vaults of silence, stripped of meaning, twisted into another human tool for dominance. And with that, the fragile proof of something greater, the evidence that death was not the end, would be gone forever. Humanity would continue to stumble in darkness, believing that faith and science were opposites instead of two reflections of the same truth. Charles stood there, heart pounding. The sirens outside wailed again, closer now. The world wanted order, but what he held was chaos disguised as grace. He realized then that this wasn't about Thalos alone. It was about what Thalos carried, what he represented. The living memory of human souls, a bridge between reason and belief, between mortality and continuity. He walked to the freezer door and pressed his hand to the cold metal. The hum resonated up his arm, through his chest, and settled in his heart. He knew the choice was already made, though he hadn't spoken it. He wouldn't call for help. He wouldn't surrender the light. Compassion, once born from duty, now evolved into something sacred, a vow to protect the truth, even if it cost him everything. And in that stillness, as the first echo of helicopter blades rolled through the morning air, he understood the weight of his decision. For the first time in years, he wasn't acting out of fear. He was acting out of faith. The air had grown dense and heavy, thick enough to taste, as though the house itself had begun to breathe. Charles stood in the basement, surrounded by silence so profound it felt alive. Thalos had not spoken aloud in hours, yet the atmosphere thrummed with a kind of expectation, a gathering of invisible currents that made the space tremble. The faint light, pulsing from the being's skin, flickered in slow, measured intervals, like the heartbeat of the earth itself. Charles felt his own pulse answering in perfect synchrony, the two rhythms merging until he could no longer tell which belonged to him. He did not know what compelled him to move closer. Perhaps it was curiosity. Perhaps the ache of awe that had replaced his fear. When he reached Thalos's side, the alien's gaze lifted, eyes not of flesh but of light, deep and endless, reflecting no image but showing everything. In that moment, Charles knew something was coming, something that would break the fragile boundary between what could be seen and what could not. The air around them seemed to bend. There was no warning, only contact. When Thalos's hand rose and touched his forehead, reality ceased to exist. It wasn't pain, nor was it comfort. It was expansion. The world around him fell away in a single exhale, as if someone had peeled back the thin skin of perception to reveal the machinery beneath existence. Charles's mind opened like an ancient door that had never been meant to close, and through it poured the infinite. He saw the earth from a height beyond atmosphere, every cloud glowing with the residue of thought. Beneath it, cities pulsed with veins of energy, not electricity but emotion, fear, love, hope, all of it weaving through the world like living circuitry. Each being emitted its own frequency, luminous threads stretching outward, intersecting, tangling, harmonizing. The planet itself glowed like a great neural network, the sum of every life feeding into a consciousness far greater than the individual mind could comprehend. Humanity was not separate from the divine. It was the instrument through which the divine expressed itself. Then the vision drew him downward, through walls and miles, into the quiet spaces where death whispered. He saw hospitals bathed in spectral light, their corridors alive with translucent shapes that hovered over the dying. They were not angels or phantoms, but fragments of awareness, souls waiting for release. Some shone bright as stars, peaceful and ready. Others flickered like weak flames, bound by fear, unable to let go. And above them all, he saw rivers of color, currents of energy that flowed through time, carrying consciousness from one form to another. Life was not a straight line, but a loop of resonance. Death was not disappearance, only migration. He wept inside the vision, though tears did not fall in that place. Every loss he had ever witnessed, the hundreds of patients whose final breaths he had recorded, the grieving families, the hollow moments after heart monitors flatlined, all of it changed shape before his eyes. Those moments were not endings. They were translations, each one a doorway, each one leading somewhere luminous and alive. The love that the dying felt, the memories they clung to, the prayers whispered by the living, none of it was wasted. It all lingered, vibrating across the infinite web that connected every being to every other. He saw beyond humanity too. The forests breathed light, every tree a silent transmitter of the planet's pulse. Oceans glimmered with invisible sound, the heartbeat of the deep echoing in wavelengths that sang of creation. Even the wind carried thought, ancient memory moving through matter. All things were alive, all things remembered. When the vision began to fade, it did not end abruptly but folded gently back into the confines of the physical world. The basement returned, dim and ordinary, but Charles was no longer the same man who had descended into it. His heart still beat with the rhythm of that cosmic lattice, his mind echoing with voices that spoke not in words, but in harmony. Thalos's hand lowered, and the air settled once more into stillness. Charles sank to his knees, his breath uneven, tears finally spilling onto the cold floor. The hum in the walls had changed. It was no longer foreign but familiar, like hearing his own soul reflected back. He understood, fully and painfully, that life and death were not opposites. They were twin movements in one eternal dance. What he had seen could never be forgotten, nor explained. He carried it now like a flame hidden behind the ribs, a light that would never go out. and though he trembled, it was not from fear, but from the unbearable beauty of truth. Night fell like a command from something vast and watching. The rain had stopped, but the silence it left behind was heavier than thunder. The air shimmered faintly with static, as if reality itself was holding its breath. Above the house, faint red lights blinked in the distance, unmanned drones cutting slow, deliberate paths through the mist. Their hum was low, mechanical, and patient. The sound of human curiosity sharpened into surveillance. Charles stood at the basement door, the faint glow from Thalos casting ghost-like reflections across the walls. He knew what that sound meant. They had found the direction of the fall, and it was only a matter of time before they found him. He moved with a kind of mechanical calm, the mind of a man who had already accepted fear as useless. Every motion was careful, silent, ritualistic. He wrapped Thalos in heavy blankets to mask the light, though the faint pulse of blue still bled through the fabric like starlight trying to escape its prison. The being was weaker now, body translucent and trembling, but still alive. The hum of his existence filled the air, vibrating with a frequency that brushed the edge of hearing. Charles could feel it in his teeth, in his bones, like a memory trying to surface. He carried him to the car parked in the shadowed driveway, heart pounding in rhythm with the approaching drones. The street was empty, but the night was not. From somewhere far off, a voice crackled through a megaphone, distorted by distance. Orders. The words were lost to the wind, but their intent was unmistakable. Containment, capture, silence. Charles opened the trunk, lined it with thick plastic and blankets, and lowered Thalos carefully inside. The hum deepened briefly, then softened, as though the being understood. When he closed the trunk, the last trace of blue light disappeared, and the world went dark again. He climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine. The headlights cut through fog that hung low like smoke over the road. Every few seconds, he glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting the sky to open with searchlights. He could still feel the vibration of the sphere hidden in the basement, calling faintly to him through walls and distance, as though it were aware of his departure. The car rolled forward slowly, tires hissing against wet asphalt, and with each turn of the wheel, the hum of drones grew fainter, replaced by the steady rhythm of his own heartbeat. The radio came alive on its own, a burst of static, followed by a familiar male voice, calm, measured, official. The emergency broadcast system. It announced a temporary curfew for residents within a 10-mile radius of the forest perimeter. The reason was listed as hazardous debris, potential contamination. No mention of what had really fallen. No mention of what they were truly hunting. The voice repeated the message twice, before fading into static again. Charles reached over and switched it off. Silence was better. Lies sounded too much like comfort. He drove on through the mist, heading toward the mountains where the road narrowed and the world grew wilder. The town lights vanished behind him, replaced by the faint luminescence of the moon filtering through the low clouds. Each mile carried him further from the world he knew and deeper into something older, quieter, almost sacred. The night felt sentient, aware of what he carried. The stars above were hidden, yet he felt their weight, their gaze. The drones had stopped following, but he knew that meant nothing. The military didn't chase. It calculated. They would trace heat signatures, triangulate movement, and follow the data until it led them to the truth. And if they found Thalos, it would not end in understanding. It would end in dissection. Charles gripped the wheel tighter, knuckles white. Ahead, the faint outline of the mountains rose like ancient sentinels against the dark. He didn't know exactly where he was going, only that the being had whispered once of coordinates hidden within the Earth's magnetic lines, a place where energy converged, a place he could return to. Behind him, the world of reason and control was closing its net, tightening with precision. Ahead lay uncertainty, but also the possibility of revelation. The road wound upward, disappearing into fog so thick it looked like the sky had fallen to the ground. Charles drove into it without hesitation, feeling the hum of the being in his trunk like a second heartbeat guiding him forward. Somewhere above the mist, unseen eyes watched from machines that had forgotten what it meant to feel. But within that fragile car, in the presence of something unearthly and dying, Charles carried the last flicker of a truth too bright for the world to ever contain. The road wound like a serpent through the valley, dark and endless, beneath a sky veiled in fog. Charles had been driving for hours, though time no longer felt linear. The hum from the trunk pulsed softly, blending with the sound of the tires cutting through the wet pavement. He could feel Thalos's presence weak, fading, but awake. The silence of the night was deceptive. Every so often, he caught faint flashes of movement in the clouds above, the mechanical wings of surveillance drones searching for something they didn't understand. He kept his headlights low, praying the car's heat signature would dissolve into the cold night air before they noticed. Then, in the distance, a barrier of light appeared, 2 armored vehicles parked across the highway, soldiers standing beneath the harsh glow of flood lamps. A checkpoint. Charles slowed, his pulse tightening, as if the air had constricted around him. There was no way around. The mountains rose like walls on either side. The forest too dense to navigate. The only path forward was through, and that meant exposure. He imagined their scanners sweeping over the car, detecting the faint radiation of the being he carried, the light of something that wasn't human. As the car crept closer, he could see their faces now blurred behind visors, gloved hands gripping rifles that gleamed under the floodlights. The world outside his windshield looked washed out and dreamlike, everything too bright, too sharp. One of the soldiers raised a hand, signaling him to stop. His heart hammered. His mind screamed at him to surrender before they forced him to. He thought of how easily they could end this. All it would take was a single question he couldn't answer. And then, from the trunk, the hum changed. It deepened, resonating through the metal of the car like a note struck on a cosmic instrument. Charles felt a pulse of energy move through him, soft but absolute. His vision blurred for a moment, colors bending and stretching until everything around him glowed faintly. His hands tightened around the steering wheel, and he could feel something touch the edge of his consciousness, as gentle as breath. It wasn't words, but understanding. Thalos was reaching into his mind. The soldiers approached, their flashlights slicing through the air. But as the beams hit the car, something shifted. Their movements slowed, their eyes unfocused, their expressions softening. The hostility melted away, as if their memories had been momentarily rewritten. One soldier stepped forward, peering through the window, but his gaze passed right through Charles as though he were nothing but light and shadow. They didn't see him. They didn't see the car. Their perception had been altered, not blinded, but redirected. To them, nothing was there but an empty stretch of road. Charles drove forward slowly, trembling. The floodlights washed over him, then faded behind as the car slipped through the checkpoint unnoticed. The hum in the trunk softened again, returning to a calm rhythm. His breathing came in shallow bursts. It wasn't invisibility. It hadn't felt like deception or magic. It had felt like the night itself had chosen not to notice him. He didn't understand how, but he could sense the explanation forming in his mind, not as sound, but as thought. The being behind him radiated quiet compassion, an emotion that filled the small space of the car like warmth after winter. The soldiers hadn't been fooled, they had been comforted. Their fear had been replaced by something else. They hadn't been forced to ignore him, they had simply seen what they were ready to see. The realization came slowly, unfolding like the bloom of a secret truth. This was not about hiding. It was about mercy. The energy that had passed through him carried a vibration that shifted the emotions of those who touched it. The soldiers didn't see an enemy or a threat, because their consciousness had been tuned to peace. It was not manipulation, it was harmony. Charles continued driving, the road narrowing as it climbed into the mountain's shadow. His body shook with adrenaline. But beneath the fear was something else, awe. For the first time, he understood that Thalos's power was not the power of domination, but of resonance. He didn't command the world to bend around him. He invited it to remember what it was made of. Every living thing was built of the same light, the same frequency. The soldiers had simply been reminded of it for one brief moment. The night air grew colder as the car climbed higher, but inside, the warmth lingered. Charles kept his eyes on the winding road ahead, the hum of the being still steady behind him, and he whispered to himself without realizing why that what he had just witnessed was not escape. It was revelation disguised as survival. The road stretched on into the fog, and for the first time since the fall, he no longer felt hunted. He felt chosen. The cabin stood alone on the mountainside, a forgotten relic swallowed by fog and pine. Its wood was gray and splintered, its windows fogged from the cold that clung to everything like breath frozen in midair. Charles had found it by chance, or perhaps by design. The narrow road had ended abruptly in darkness, and when he saw the faint outline of the structure through the mist, something inside him knew this was where they were meant to stop. The forest was utterly silent, the kind of silence that feels aware. Even the wind seemed to hold back, listening. Inside, the air was stale and still. The walls smelled of old smoke and damp wood. Charles lit a lantern he found hanging from a nail and set it on a crooked table, its flame casting trembling shadows across the room. The moment he opened the trunk, the atmosphere shifted. The faint light spilling from Thalos's body illuminated the entire cabin with an otherworldly softness, bending every shadow toward him like darkness itself was drawn to the warmth of his being. The creature was weaker than before, his once radiant form now dulled, the translucent glow in his chest flickering like a candle near its end. Yet even diminished, his presence filled the room with a stillness that felt sacred. Charles made a makeshift bed near the hearth, spreading blankets and setting Thalos upon them. The sphere, still sealed in the container, pulsed faintly in rhythm with his heartbeat. The glow from both resonated, forming ripples of faint energy that seemed to hum in harmony. Charles sat beside him, listening not with his ears but with something deeper, something in his bones. The being's consciousness pressed gently against his own, a tide of thought without sound or language, until meaning began to take shape. Thalos revealed his mission not with words, but through understanding that unfolded within Charles's mind like the slow revelation of dawn. The sphere he carried, the crystalline core of light and memory, was not a relic or a weapon. It was an archive, a collection of the purest fragments of human essence, souls, memories, frequencies of consciousness, preserved at the moment of transition between life and death. It had been gathering for millennia, guiding the balance of existence between the physical and the spiritual. But something had gone wrong. The harmony between the worlds was fracturing. Through the transmission of thought, Charles saw it. The invisible network that once connected all living beings, now dimmed and unstable. Human lives pulsed like fading lights scattered across the earth, each one flickering in isolation. The cycle of reincarnation that once allowed consciousness to evolve, to remember and learn, had become corrupted. Souls were returning fragmented, stripped of memory, losing their continuity through each rebirth. The result was amnesia on a planetary scale, civilizations rising and collapsing without recollection of why, knowledge rediscovered and forgotten again in endless repetition. Thalos showed him visions of ancient times when humanity's spiritual frequency had been whole. People then could feel the pulse of the planet, could hear the quiet dialogue between earth and sky. But as greed, violence, and fear expanded, the magnetic resonance that bound human consciousness to the planet's core began to fracture. Every generation remembered less, believed less, trusted less in what connected them to everything else. Your species is fragmenting. The thought resonated. Each incarnation forgets more. Each mind grows heavier with noise. Soon, the vibration that sustains your faith will vanish entirely. Charles saw flashes of humanity's future cities gleaming with cold perfection, machines that imitated divinity, and a silence between souls so deep it swallowed meaning. The light of connection would dim until faith became superstition, and then superstition became myth, and finally, myth became extinction of spirit. The world would continue spinning, but hollow, devoid of awareness of what it once was. Thalos's purpose was to stop it. The archive had to be returned to the magnetic heart of the planet, to restore resonance, to remind Earth of its living memory. The core was not only iron and heat, it was consciousness itself, a cosmic organ beating in tune with creation. To place the archive there would repair the broken frequency and reawaken humanity's memory of the divine. The vision faded. The glow around Thalos dimmed to a faint shimmer, and Charles felt his own heart racing as the weight of revelation settled over him. He realized that this being was not only saving a species, he was saving meaning itself. Outside, the wind began again, howling softly through the trees, as though it too had heard the confession and was mourning what had been forgotten. Inside the cabin, Charles sat beside Thalos in silence, watching the pulse of light slowly fade and wondering if he was witnessing the last chance humanity would ever have to remember who it truly was. The night deepened around the cabin, swallowing the mountains in a silence so pure that even time seemed reluctant to move. The fire had long since died into embers, yet a faint luminescence persisted, soft, unearthly, radiating from the being resting on the floor. It wasn't light in the ordinary sense. It didn't cast shadows or obey the rules of reflection. It simply was an illumination of presence that filled every corner of the room with a strange serenity. Charles sat near it, unable to tear his eyes away. He had heard truths no human was meant to hear, seen visions that tore the thin curtain separating mortality from eternity. And now, as the reality of it settled in, something within him began to fracture. He looked at the being before him and felt a confusion so profound it bordered on reverence. His entire life had been governed by science, by measurable evidence and predictable results. He had been trained to define phenomena through observation, to weigh the world by what could be proven. But Thalos, whatever he was, defied every definition, yet felt more real than any proof he had ever known. The air around the creature carried harmony. The vibrations that once seemed alien now resonated with something deep inside him, as though his own soul recognized the frequency. It wasn't foreign, it was forgotten. The thought came to him unbidden, a whisper rising from the depths of his mind. "Are you an angel?" It wasn't spoken aloud, but it didn't need to be. Thalos's consciousness rippled through the air like soundless music, and Charles understood the answer before it formed into words. The being did not think in human terms. It did not use language. Yet meaning poured into him clear, deliberate, and vast. Humanity, in its long search for truth, had once given many names to such visitors: angels, messengers, watchers. But the truth was more intricate, less mythic, yet infinitely more divine. "You call us that," the thought resonated, filling Charles's mind. "But we are not what your stories made us. We are the mechanics of faith, the architecture of belief itself. When your species lost its direct communion with the source, we became the bridge. We did not come to rule or to judge, only to sustain the connection between spirit and creation, to preserve memory until you could hear the source again on your own." The words or the vibration of meaning reverberated through him until his body trembled. The phrase "mechanics of faith" echoed again and again, colliding with everything he had ever believed. In all his years surrounded by the dying, He had wondered why so many spoke of light, of warmth, of peace that science could never quantify. He had dismissed it as brain chemistry, as oxygen deprivation, as hallucination born from the fear of ceasing to exist. But now, sitting in the glow of a being that pulsed with both reason and holiness, he realized that every one of those moments might have been real tiny ruptures where the unseen reached through to guide the soul home. Tears began to fall, slow and uncontrolled. They weren't tears of fear or sorrow, but of recognition. For the first time, he understood that science and faith had never been enemies. They were two instruments tuned to the same truth, vibrating in harmony from different ends of the same spectrum. What he had seen through the sphere, what he had felt through Thalos's touch, was not magic. It was law, an order older than atoms, structured with the precision of a cosmic equation and the tenderness of a prayer. The boundaries between divinity and discovery dissolved before him. The ancient war between belief and knowledge was an illusion created by blindness, not opposition. Faith was not ignorance, and science was not rebellion. Both were languages of the same source, one spoken by the heart, the other by the mind. Humanity had simply forgotten how to translate between them. Outside, wind whispered through the pines, carrying the rhythm of unseen waves moving across the atmosphere. It sounded almost like breath. The faint pulse from Thalos's body quickened for a moment, casting shifting shadows across the floor, as if the being itself was drawing closer to the unseen current that connected it to its home. The air hummed softly, vibrating in resonance with the human heartbeat that now trembled in awe. Charles pressed a hand to his chest, overwhelmed by the truth that now lived inside him. What he had once called faith had returned, not as doctrine, but as awareness, a luminous understanding that the divine was not above him or beyond him, but within him, written into every cell and every thought. His tears fell onto the wooden floor, absorbed instantly by the earth beneath. And in that stillness, illuminated by the soft blue glow, he understood that belief was never about worship. It was about remembering what had always been true. The mountain night was a living silence, a kind of darkness that breathed. The wind moved softly through the trees, whispering in tones that seemed to echo from somewhere far older than the world itself. Inside the cabin, the air trembled faintly, as if holding its breath. Thalos rested near the dying embers of the fire, his light reduced to a faint pulse deep within his chest, like the echo of a star on the verge of extinction. Charles sat alone at the small table, staring at the sealed container that held the sphere. Its glow seeped faintly through the metal seams, flickering like a heartbeat that refused to die. He had told himself he wouldn't touch it again. He was afraid of what it carried, of what it might reveal if opened. But fear has a gravity of its own, and sooner or later, all things are pulled toward it. He reached out with shaking hands and lifted the container's lid. The glow flooded the room instantly, warm and soft but immense, expanding outward like liquid sunrise. The sphere hovered slightly above the table, rotating with slow grace, and with every turn it sang a frequency too low to hear, yet too profound to ignore. The sound reached through his chest and into the marrow of his bones. The vibration deepened, filling the cabin with invisible waves that made the lantern flicker and the walls groan. And then the voices began. At first they were faint, like whispers carried on a distant wind. Then they multiplied, overlapping, merging, dissolving into one another until the room was alive with sound. They were human voices, countless and unending. Some cried out in terror, others in peace. Some whispered names, apologies, last confessions. Charles could hear the raw edge of mortality in every tone. The regret of missed chances, the gratitude of love remembered, the desperate reaching for something beyond the threshold of breath. The sound was unbearable and beautiful all at once. He realized what he was hearing were the final thoughts of humanity itself, the last vibrations of consciousness as it left the body. Every soul the sphere had ever touched spoke at once, a living archive of departure. The air shimmered with emotions so pure it transcended language. Regret and hope braided together like twin threads of light, while laughter and sorrow pulsed in rhythm, forming an impossible harmony that felt both divine and familiar. Charles fell to his knees, tears streaming down his face. The sound wasn't just around him, it was inside him, filling every hollow place within his heart. And then, among the endless chorus, one voice separated from the rest. It was softer, closer, wrapped in warmth he hadn't felt in decades. A voice he had heard as a child during fevers and nightmares, a lullaby of reassurance that once tethered him to safety. His mother's voice. Her words were faint, but they carried perfectly through the noise. A prayer she had whispered in her final moments years ago. Long before he became a man who no longer believed, she hadn't prayed for herself. She had prayed for him that he would one day remember that the soul was real. The sound of it broke him completely. He pressed his hands to his ears, but the voice wasn't in the air anymore. It was in him. The light of the sphere grew brighter, pulsing like a second sun within the cabin, until everything else faded: the floor, the walls, the boundaries between memory and reality. He saw flashes of faces, strangers and loved ones alike, all woven together into one endless fabric of being. There was no separation, no individuality, only one great consciousness speaking through billions of human fragments. It wasn't chaos, it was unity disguised as noise. As the intensity peaked, Charles felt a presence behind the sound, a calm, steady awareness that transcended the human voices. It was Thalos, not moving, not speaking, but resonating through the energy that filled the room. The meaning formed in Charles's mind without words, clear as breath. "Now you know why we collect them, to preserve your light." The glow softened, the chorus faded, and the hum receded until only silence remained. Charles fell forward, breathless, face wet with tears. The sphere hovered briefly, its light dimming, before settling gently back into stillness. The cabin was silent again, the night unchanged, but everything inside him had been rewritten. He looked at the sphere one last time, realizing it wasn't just a vessel, it was humanity's memory, the proof that every moment mattered, every emotion endured, and every life echoed beyond its end. Outside, the wind sighed through the forest again, carrying with it the faintest trace of that impossible harmony. It sounded like hope. The morning was too still, the kind of stillness that carries intent. The fog had thinned around the mountains, revealing a pale sky streaked with the faint silver of dawn. Charles had not slept since the night of the voices. His mind was raw, torn open by what he had heard, the echo of billions. The truth that death was not silence, but transformation. He felt changed, but change came with fear. The weight of what he now carried, both in his hands and in his soul, was far greater than anything he could contain. Every sound outside made his heart leap. Every gust of wind felt like warning. Far away, in a town still half asleep, someone else stirred with concern. Elena, his co-worker at the hospice, had spent the last few days trying to reach him. His disappearance had spread through whispered rumors. Some said he had fallen ill, others that he had gone mad. When she found his phone abandoned at the hospital, still filled with unanswered messages, she acted on instinct. She called the local authorities, saying only that she feared for his safety, that he had spoken of strange lights, of something falling from the sky. She didn't know her words would become coordinates, that the quiet hum of compassion would awaken a machinery of power. Within hours, the message reached the wrong ears. The military net, which had already been tightening around the mountains, finally closed. Drones were dispatched before sunrise, their metallic wings slicing through the clouds like silent predators. The forest below filled with infrared light and the mechanical rhythm of rotors cutting through air. From space, satellites recalibrated. their sensors locking onto a faint electromagnetic pulse originating from one remote location, a cabin, deep in the folds of the Earth. Inside that cabin, the hum of the sphere had grown unsteady. Its once harmonious pulse now wavered, like the heartbeat of a dying planet. Thalos's light had dimmed further, his form sinking into itself as if gravity had begun to pull him apart, molecule by molecule. The geometry of his body, once perfect and fluid, now trembled at its edges. Charles could feel the change in the air. The resonance that had once filled the space now struggled to sustain itself, its rhythm faltering. It was as though the very fabric that anchored Thalos to this world was beginning to unravel. Outside, faint shadows moved between the trees, drones scanning, soldiers advancing. Charles looked out the narrow window and saw beams of red sweeping across the mist, like the eyes of a sleeping god awakening. A low vibration filled the cabin, rising from the ground upward, the kind of hum that precedes arrival. He knew they were close. Thalos's consciousness touched his own once more. Weaker now, fragile but resolute. The words formed like tremors of meaning inside his mind. "We are running out of time." The phrase carried more than urgency. It carried sorrow, inevitability, and something that felt like farewell. Charles's thoughts spiraled. He imagined Elena's face, her worried voice on the phone, her simple act of concern turning into catastrophe. None of it was her fault. She could never have known what he had hidden here, what truth she had accidentally exposed. Humanity's instinct to protect always came paired with its instinct to control. The same empathy that had driven her to call would now bring destruction. The hum intensified, vibrating through the floorboards, making the nails groan. Thalos's body flickered with faint streaks of light, like veins of lightning trapped beneath translucent skin. The pressure in the room built until Charles's ears rang. Outside, the forest lit up in flashes, infrared beams sweeping, engines roaring closer. He could almost hear the synchronized movement of boots in the distance, the inevitable march of containment. He turned back toward Thalos, whose body was beginning to distort, folding inward, his form collapsing under the weight of the very gravity that held the world together. The laws of physics were reclaiming what did not belong to them. The being's energy was faltering. Every breath he took seemed to ripple the air, his glow reduced to a faint, trembling outline. And in that moment, Charles understood the real betrayal was not Elena's call, nor the soldier's pursuit, but the quiet betrayal of time itself, the slow collapse of miracles beneath the weight of fear and ignorance. Humanity's instinct to control the unknown had always been its greatest wound. The sky outside broke open with the metallic roar of drones descending through the mist. Their lights cut through the trees like burning eyes, searching for truth to cage. Inside the cabin, the air shuddered with the strain of dimensions overlapping. Thalos's voice trembled through the vibration one final time. They are coming. The cycle is closing. The bridge must be completed before it collapses. Charles felt his pulse synchronize with the dying hum of the being beside him. The mountains seemed to inhale, and the world held still, waiting for what came next. The sky had begun to bruise, streaked with violet and gray as the first tremors of dawn rippled across the horizon. The forest below Mount Shasta was a labyrinth of mist and shadow, its trees bending beneath the cold breath of wind that carried whispers from the higher slopes. Charles moved through it with a single purpose, guided not by reason, but by something older and stronger, a pull that came from both within and beyond him. The road had ended miles ago, but the mountain itself seemed to open paths for them, narrow veins of stone that led upward toward the unseen. Behind him, the soft glow of Thalos's presence followed, faint and flickering like a dying constellation struggling to remain in the sky. The storm had been gathering all night, an immense pulse of energy that hummed through the clouds. Distant thunder rolled across the valley, echoing like the slow awakening of something divine. Charles could feel electricity in the air, an invisible current that lifted the hair on his arms and filled the air with the metallic taste of transformation. Each step grew heavier, as gravity seemed to resist their ascent, the world itself reluctant to let them leave its surface. Thalos was weakening rapidly. His once fluid movements had become labored, his form no longer as defined. The luminous energy that once rippled beneath his translucent skin was now fractured, breaking into fragments that shimmered and dissolved like dust in sunlight. Yet even as his body faltered, the light within his chest glowed brighter, as though all of him were gathering there for one final purpose. They reached a clearing halfway up the slope, where the forest thinned, and the earth opened into a wide expanse of exposed rock. The mountain stretched endlessly above them, its peak veiled by a storm that glowed faintly from within. The air trembled with static, and lightning forked across the valley below, illuminating the land in flashes that revealed vast distances, rivers like silver veins, clouds rolling like oceans. Charles stopped to catch his breath, but Thalos did not rest. He seemed to be drawn upward by something unseen, his feet barely touching the ground. The thought entered Charles's mind like a whisper carried by wind. It wasn't sound but understanding. The final step had come. The archive, the sphere of light and voices, had to be merged with the Earth's magnetic field, deep within the planet's energetic core. Only then could balance be restored. Only then could the human soul regain its resonance with creation. But the act demanded a sacrifice. The energy required to anchor the archive would consume Thalos completely, dissolving his form into pure frequency. His essence would return to the source, but his presence here would end. Charles felt the truth of it before Thalos even shared it. The realization struck like cold water, cutting through the awe that had guided him so far. He could not accept it. The being before him was not only alien, he was something sacred, something that embodied both the divine and the rational in perfect harmony. To lose him now felt like erasing the bridge between two worlds. But Thalos's thoughts were unwavering. This was his purpose. He had come not to survive, but to complete. The sky cracked open with another flash, brighter this time, and for a moment the entire mountain was bathed in light. The air pulsed with a low hum that shook the stones beneath their feet. Charles could see threads of energy moving through the clouds, lines of force connecting Earth to the heavens, invisible until now. It was as though the mountain itself was alive, waiting, ancient machinery preparing for activation. Thalos turned toward the summit, his form now little more than radiance shaped by memory, the faint outline of a face, eyes filled with impossible calm. Charles's thoughts spiraled into desperation. He wanted to stop him, to find another way. He would have given his own life if it meant sparing this being who had shown him the truth of existence. But Thalos's energy was already ascending, his light flickering higher, every pulse weaker but more focused. His message came through one last time, clear and absolute. The body is not the keeper of faith. Faith lives in continuity. I will not survive the transfer, but faith will. Charles felt the words resonate inside him, not as sound, but as imprint, a truth carved into the very structure of his being. Around them, the storm reached its crescendo. The mountain's magnetic field, crackling with power. He looked up toward the summit and realized that faith was not meant to preserve what already existed, but to transform it. The loss he feared was only the beginning of understanding. The wind rose into a howl, carrying dust and fragments of light that spun around them in a luminous spiral. The mountain seemed to pulse like a living heart. Charles took one last step toward the being who had changed everything, reaching out as if his touch could stop what had already begun. The moment his hand met the edge of Thalos's fading glow, the storm broke open completely, and the light from the sky descended like revelation. The mountain trembled. the world inhaled. And faith prepared to be reborn. The storm had reached its breaking point. Lightning split the heavens with violent elegance, the sky opening in white veins that briefly revealed the silhouettes of soldiers moving like shadows across the slopes. The sound of rotor blades echoed above the mountain, low and methodical, each beat of the air punctuated by the hum of machines locking onto their coordinates. Agent Hollis stood at the command post near the base, his face illuminated by the flicker of holographic screens displaying heat signatures and electromagnetic readings that defied logic. He had been trained for conflict, for control, but not for miracles. And yet, even through the chaos, he felt a quiet certainty that what was unfolding on Mount Shasta was not an operation. It was revelation disguised as pursuit. The soldiers moved in tight formation, their boots crushing the frost-bitten soil as they ascended toward the light blooming at the summit. The air itself resisted them. Instruments failed, compasses spun wildly, and the radios filled with static that sounded almost like a voice whispering beneath the noise. They pressed on anyway, driven by the order that had already become commandment: surrender the entity. Above them, the beam of light pierced through the thick clouds like a column of fire reaching toward the stars. Charles and Thalos stood near the mountain's ridge, the world around them trembling. The storm bent to the being's energy, the winds spiraling outward in great rings of luminous mist. The mountain no longer felt like stone. It throbbed like a living heart, pulsing with the resonance of something eternal buried deep within. Charles could see Thalos's form breaking apart, his body shedding light that drifted upward like pieces of a dying star. The sight was unbearable, a being unraveling before his eyes, not from weakness, but from purpose. Then came the sound of engines, the rhythmic crunch of boots, the metallic whisper of rifles being raised. The soldiers emerged from the fog, weapons pointed, their visors reflecting the light from Thalos's chest. For a moment, none of them moved. The air was thick with fear, but also awe. The megaphone cracked through the static, the amplified voice of Agent Hollis commanding them to surrender. The words were simple, mechanical, but the tone carried hesitation, like a man obeying orders he no longer believed in. Charles stepped forward, his body instinctively shielding Thalos. He knew it was futile. He was one man against an army, but something greater had already claimed him. The first gunshot broke the tension. Then another. The air filled with the sound of metal slicing through wind. But before the bullets reached them, they stopped. Every projectile froze mid-air, suspended in a web of invisible energy that shimmered faintly with light. The soldiers stared in disbelief, unable to comprehend what their eyes were showing them. The bullets hung there like insects caught in amber, motionless, weightless, waiting for something to decide their fate. The mountain fell silent again. The only sound was the low hum that emanated from Thalos, rising in frequency until it vibrated in their bones. The soldiers began to back away, the courage that had carried them up the slope dissolving into a primal instinct to flee. And then, Thalos moved. Slowly, deliberately, he stepped forward, his bare feet touching the frozen ground. The light streaming from his wounds intensified, spilling out through every fracture in his form. It was not the cold white of machinery, but the living gold of creation, warm and infinite. Every drop of it shimmered with the essence of memory, the echo of voices, the residue of faith. Hollis watched from below, transfixed. He knew then that they were witnessing something sacred disguised as defiance. Thalos's body was collapsing, but his presence was expanding, radiating outward through every molecule of the air. The soldiers dropped their weapons, some falling to their knees as if instinct alone remembered how to worship. The invisible field rippled outward, and for a brief, impossible moment, every instrument of violence, every gun, every drone, every bullet suspended mid-flight was rendered powerless. The mountain itself seemed to hum a single note, a tone that resonated with both terror and grace. Charles turned toward the being beside him, and saw what looked like a sun emerging from within a dying body. The light grew brighter, purer, and even as the storm raged around them, it felt like dawn. Thalos was not resisting the assault. He was completing it. The energy flowing from him was not destruction but release, as though he was unbinding the gravity that held humanity to its illusions. The soldiers who had come to capture him stood frozen, their eyes filled with light that reflected the truth they were never meant to see. The bullets fell to the ground one by one, harmless, their metallic clang swallowed by the wind. In that moment, the mountain became a sanctuary suspended between heaven and earth, a place where faith and fear faced each other in silence. And Thalos, luminous and fading, raised his head toward the storm as the last of his light began to rise into the sky. The mountain was trembling beneath the weight of revelation. The storm no longer sounded like thunder but like the earth remembering something ancient and divine. The light pouring from Thalos illuminated the summit in a halo that defied all known color, shimmering in tones that existed somewhere between gold and sound. The soldiers had retreated to the lower slopes, unable to face the brilliance that now consumed the air. Even Agent Hollis, hardened by years of commands and silence, could only stand frozen at the base, staring upward at a phenomenon that no human tongue could accurately name. The world seemed suspended between two realities, and Charles stood at its center, a trembling figure of flesh caught between mortality and eternity. Thalos turned toward him. His body had begun to fragment into particles of light, breaking apart but not fading, each piece a star drifting away from the whole. The luminous patterns across his skin pulsed in slow, rhythmic harmony, echoing the deep resonance that had filled the mountain since their arrival. Charles could feel the vibrations pressing through the air, moving through his chest, synchronizing with his own heartbeat. The rhythm was identical, as though two lives were already converging into one. He tried to speak, but no sound came. Words felt irrelevant here, too small for what stood before him. Thalos approached silently, the ground trembling faintly with each step. In his hands, he held the sphere, the soul archive, the living core that shimmered like liquid fire. Within it, the voices of humanity still whispered, millions of thoughts woven together into a single hum that vibrated with the essence of existence itself. The light radiating from it was not blinding but tender, the kind of light that reveals rather than obscures. Charles felt a pulse of understanding move through him before Thalos even reached him. The truth came not as language but as realization. The being would not survive the merging. The act of anchoring the archive to Earth's magnetic heart would require complete dissolution. Thalos would become pure resonance, his consciousness joining the same field that sustained all living things. It was not death. Not in any human sense, it was the return of the note to the song. The being raised the sphere between them. The glow expanded until the edges of their forms blurred into radiance. Thalos pressed the orb against Charles's chest, and for a moment there was only light. It pierced through flesh and bone without pain, fusing into him, settling beneath his sternum where his own heartbeat once ruled alone. The vibration was overwhelming. He felt the memories of countless souls move through him, their last breaths, their first laughs, their infinite questions. Every life that had ever touched the archive now flowed inside him. He was no longer merely a man. He was the echo of humanity's collective memory. Thalos's voice entered his mind one last time, clear and steady amid the storm. You will carry the frequency now. Faith is not belief. It is resonance. It is alignment with what is already true. The words rippled through Charles's consciousness until they became indistinguishable from his own thoughts. He understood then that faith had never been a matter of seeing or proving. It was the act of vibrating in harmony with the unseen, of remembering what the soul already knew, but the mind had forgotten. The sky roared as the mountain's energy reached its apex. Lightning cracked across the clouds, spiraling upward instead of down. The storm bent inward, as if folding into itself, the clouds forming a great vortex of light above the summit. Thalos turned toward it, his form now almost completely dissolved into luminescent particles. His body shimmered with the elegance of farewell. He walked forward slowly, each step leaving a faint trail of light that lingered in the air like the residue of grace. Charles tried to reach for him, but his body would not move. The energy coursing through him held him still, anchoring him to the earth that now pulsed in rhythm with his own heart. The mountain itself seemed alive, trembling as though it too understood the sacrifice unfolding upon its crown. Thalos's final steps were not of departure but of becoming. When he reached the heart of the storm, his entire being expanded in a single pulse of brilliance that split the clouds wide open. The beam of light that had pierced the sky now turned inward, drawing him into its center. There was no explosion, no sound of destruction, only a great inhalation, as if the universe itself had taken a breath. For an instant, the mountain was weightless. The light folded inward, then vanished. And in that impossible silence that followed, Charles felt it. The pulse, the frequency, the heartbeat of Thalos still inside him merged with his own. The world had gone quiet. But within that quiet lived a song, one that would never end. One that only faith could hear. The light vanished as suddenly as it had come, leaving the mountain wrapped in a silence that felt unearthly. For a long moment, the world seemed emptied of sound, as though the atmosphere itself had forgotten how to vibrate. The storm dissipated into nothingness. The air no longer moved. Even gravity felt uncertain. Every soldier on the slope stood paralyzed, eyes wide, mouths open, their vision consumed by the last flare of brilliance that had devoured the summit. It was not light in the human sense. It was awareness, something that had entered their minds, flooded their senses, and left behind only the residue of awe and terror. When the brightness finally withdrew, their sight returned slowly, patchy and pale, like old film re-exposed to the world. The mountain was no longer burning. The clouds had vanished entirely, leaving a vast, unmarred sky streaked with gold from the coming dawn. The snow on the peaks reflected it back like mirrors, untouched by the violence that had come before. The soldiers blinked against the glare, disoriented, their weapons forgotten. The radios crackled with static and broken voices. No one seemed to remember the order that had brought them here. For several minutes, the only movement was the slow shifting of mist curling around their feet. When the vision cleared completely, they saw what remained at the center of the ridge. The being was gone. The beam of light had disappeared. The air, though still humming faintly with energy, held no trace of Thalos's form or the glowing sphere he had carried. Only Charles remained. He stood motionless near the summit's edge, his clothes torn, his face streaked with dirt and tears. But beneath the grime, his skin glowed faintly, as if the light that had consumed the mountain had not left him entirely. The soft radiance pulsed gently from his chest, precisely where Thalos had pressed the sphere into him. It was faint, subtle, but unmistakable. The soldiers approached with caution. Their fear mingled with something that felt like reverence. The man before them looked human, but there was something different in his eyes, a depth that unsettled them, as if he were seeing through layers of reality they couldn't perceive. When they demanded answers, he did not resist. He simply lowered his gaze, silent, exhausted beyond language. The moment they touched him, the glow dimmed, as though acknowledging that his role as witness was complete. They bound his hands and led him down the mountain, not as a prisoner of war, but as a man whose presence defied explanation. The interrogation began the following day, deep within a military facility sealed against light. Charles was questioned for hours by men who hid behind mirrored glass and tape recorders. They asked him what had happened on Mount Shasta, what kind of weapon he had encountered, what energy had annihilated their machines and blinded their men. His answers only deepened their confusion. He spoke calmly of frequencies, of faith as vibration, of the being who had come not to destroy, but to restore balance to a fractured world. The officers exchanged looks of irritation, then disbelief. By the third hour, their questions shifted tone from interrogation to psychological evaluation. He was tested, scanned, observed. Machines measured his pulse, his oxygen, his neural activity. Everything appeared normal, except for the faint electromagnetic field radiating from his chest, impossible to classify. The scientists whispered among themselves, adjusting their instruments, convinced the anomaly was mechanical error. But when they cut the power to the room, the readings persisted. The light within him, though invisible to the naked eye, existed beyond their tools' comprehension. Within days, the report was finalized. The official record described him as a delusional survivor of an atmospheric incident, suffering from trauma-induced hallucination. The soldier's partial blindness was attributed to light exposure from unknown aerial phenomena. The case was closed quietly, archived beneath layers of bureaucracy. The man once known as Charles Mercer ceased to exist on paper, reassigned to a psychiatric ward under observation. But at night, when the lights went out and the halls grew still, nurses sometimes claimed to see a faint glow emanating from his room, a soft pulse that made their machines flicker and their hearts race without reason. Some said they heard voices whispering near him, not in any language they knew, but in a harmony that soothed rather than frightened. The doctors dismissed it as imagination, electrical interference, fatigue, but those who stayed long enough in his presence swore they left with tears in their eyes, unable to explain why. The military moved on, the world turned again, and the mountain returned to silence. Yet beneath the surface of ordinary life, something had changed. Somewhere in the deep magnetic heart of the earth, a new frequency pulsed, a steady rhythm, resonating quietly beneath oceans and cities, beneath fear and disbelief. Humanity could not hear it yet, but it was there, waiting. And in a small, dimly lit room where one man slept under observation, that same rhythm beat within his chest, echoing through time, carrying the light of what the world had chosen to forget. The seasons turned quietly, as though the earth itself wished to forget what had happened on the mountain. The snow melted into rivers that carried away the remnants of that strange light, and the world resumed its rhythm of ordinary days. News outlets spoke briefly of seismic anomalies, of electrical storms with no meteorological cause, but soon even those stories vanished, buried beneath newer distractions. The official files were sealed, redacted into silence. The soldiers who had witnessed the event were relocated, debriefed, and told to forget. Most did. But not all. Charles returned to the only place that had ever felt like purpose, the hospice. The building hadn't changed. Its white corridors still smelled faintly of antiseptic and lavender, and the quiet still clung to its walls like an invisible mist. But something within him had changed beyond recognition. To the nurses and doctors, he seemed calmer than before, quieter, almost luminous in his stillness. No one spoke about what had happened, though everyone sensed that whatever he had endured had not broken him. It had rewritten him. He moved through the halls with the slow grace of someone who had seen eternity and returned with its echo in his pulse. His patients trusted him instinctively. The dying always know whom they can trust. He sat beside them as he always had, listening, holding hands, adjusting pillows, watching the monitors, but now, when the final moments came, he felt something more. It began as a soft vibration in his chest, a gentle hum that resonated with the rhythm of their last breaths. Then, the air would change. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. The light in the room would shift slightly, as if the atmosphere itself were acknowledging the departure. Sometimes it shimmered faintly above the bed, like heat rising from a candle flame. Sometimes it pulsed through the curtains, casting strange patterns across the floor. The others dismissed it as imagination, the tricks of tired eyes, but Charles knew what it was. It was the frequency, the same pulse that now lived inside him, responding to the release of another soul. When the time came, when the machines began their slow decline into flat lines and soft alarms, he would lean close to the patient's ear and whisper the words Thalos had given him. "Don't be afraid. You're only changing form." The phrase carried no doctrine, no promise of heaven or threat of hell. It was simply truth, spoken gently, and every time he said it, he felt the hum within him deepen, joining with something unseen. The room would grow warm, peaceful, as though the air itself exhaled relief. Some of the nurses began to notice patterns. His patients no longer died with fear in their eyes. There were no desperate gasps, no final struggles. Their bodies relaxed in a way that seemed almost voluntary, as if they recognized the moment for what it was, a transition, not an ending. Even the monitors behaved strangely. The electrical noise that usually followed death was gone, replaced by a brief harmonic tone before the signal faded completely. It was as if something invisible reached through the circuits to acknowledge passage. Charles never spoke of the light that lingered afterward, though sometimes it stayed for minutes before dissolving. He only bowed his head and remained until it faded, treating each moment like prayer. He no longer asked questions of the divine. He had learned that faith was not curiosity, it was recognition. Every life, every passing, was now part of the same resonance that filled the world. At night, when the halls emptied and silence reclaimed the building, he would walk alone through the rooms, feeling the pulse beneath the floors. It was faint, but constant, the same rhythm that had once shaken the mountain, the same vibration that now thrummed within his bones. He understood that the world was beginning to change, quietly, invisibly. Somewhere deep in the planet's magnetic heart, the archive had merged, just as Thalos intended. The bridge had been restored. Humanity's frequency was rising again, one life at a time. And so he continued his work, day after day, death after death, guiding each soul across the threshold with the calm of a man who no longer feared what waited beyond. Each time he whispered the words, the hum within him answered. And though no one else could see it, Charles knew that faith had returned not as belief, but as light, moving soundlessly through the air each time a soul remembered how to go home. The years passed like whispers through a half-lit corridor. The world moved on, but Charles remained a quiet constant in its periphery, a man who had once touched eternity and then chosen to return to the small, fragile realm of the living. His hair turned white. His hands grew thin, yet the faint radiance within him never faded. To those who saw him, he seemed ordinary, a hospice nurse nearing the end of his life, surrounded by the dying as he had always been. But to the few who stayed long enough to listen, there was something else about him, something they could never name. The air around him seemed gentler. Machines behaved strangely when he entered a room. Clocks slowed. The dying smiled as they took their final breath. He had stopped explaining these things long ago. The world didn't want revelation. It wanted evidence. And what he carried could not be measured or dissected. It could only be felt. So he learned to keep his miracles quiet, allowing the light within him to do its work unseen. Still, as he grew older and his body began to falter, a sense of duty stirred in him, a knowing that his time as keeper of the frequency was coming to its end. The light inside him, the last remnant of Thalos's gift, pulsed differently now. It was fading, not in strength, but in ownership. Preparing to return to the source from which it came, he began to write, not for fame, not for recognition, but for remembrance. Late into the nights, under the soft hum of an old lamp, he filled pages with his recollections. The mountain, the light, the voice, the truth about death and faith and the resonance that bound them. He wrote in careful detail, as though guided by invisible hands, ensuring that nothing would be lost to time. The nurses sometimes found him asleep at his desk, pen still in hand, the faintest glow emanating from his chest through the thin fabric of his shirt. They whispered about him in the hallways, calling him the man who prays without words. In those final weeks, when he could no longer walk without help, he asked for an old recorder to be placed beside his bed. The staff believed he meant to dictate memoirs, but what he left was something deeper, a testament. His voice, though fragile, carried a calm that reached beyond human grief. The words came slow, steady, shaped by memory and meaning. "I didn't hide an alien from the military," he said softly, his tone filled with reverence rather than regret. "I hid a messenger from heaven disguised as science." What he was hiding wasn't technology. It was the memory of God inside every soul. He paused often, as though listening to something only he could hear, the low vibration that had followed him all these years, the heartbeat of creation itself. "You won't find proof of what happened," he continued. "Not in the mountains or the sky. Proof is the language of doubt. Faith speaks in resonance. You'll feel it in the quiet moments between breaths, in the warmth that comes when someone forgives you, in the stillness of a soul ready to let go. That's where he is. That's where we all are." The recorder clicked softly as it continued to spin. The nurses found him hours later, peaceful, eyes closed, a faint smile resting on his face. The light that had once lived in his chest was gone, but the air around him shimmered faintly, as though reality itself bowed in gratitude. On the wall beside his bed, a flicker of blue light danced briefly across the paint, soft, pulsing, familiar. It lasted only a moment, yet those who saw it swore it moved with intention, as if tracing the outline of a presence unseen. Then, just before the room fell still again, the silence broke not with sound, but with understanding. A voice, gentle and radiant, seemed to ripple through the air. Felt more than heard. "Well done, Charles." The nurses said it was imagination, the trick of tired minds in a room heavy with grief. But somewhere beyond sight, in the luminous architecture of existence, a vibration carried that message outward through air, through earth, through every field of energy that bound the living to the eternal. The resonance found its home again, and in that infinite stillness between moments, the world exhaled. The mountain far to the north trembled once, faintly, as though remembering. Deep beneath its surface, where the archive had long merged with the planet's heart, the frequency pulsed again, steady, eternal, alive. The song of faith continued, no longer hidden, no longer silent. It vibrated through every soul that dared to listen, whispering the truth Charles had carried his entire life. Death was not the end. It was the return to the sound from which everything began.